Welcome to HOA Control Freaks. The board picked the wrong week to play games. I am standing in my driveway in Erie, Pennsylvania, staring at a woman in a blue parka who is holding a tape measure like it is a weapon. And she is screaming at me about snow depth. Her name is Gloria Collins, vice chair of the Northwind Meadows HOA Design Review Board, and she just told me I owe $500 because my sidewalk has 3 inches of snow on it instead of 2. I work as a warehouse forklift lead and I cannot miss overtime, but Gloria does not care about my job. She is leaning over a cracked-lid salt bucket I left on my porch, jabbing her finger at the ice crust on the rim, yelling that it is a hazard and a violation of the snow policy she will not let me read. "If you make me repeat myself, it gets more expensive," she says, snapping the tape measure closed with a loud click. I moved to this neighborhood 6 months ago because the rent was cheap and the commute to the warehouse was under 15 minutes, but Northwind Meadows HOA turned out to be a place where normal life becomes an enforcement opportunity. Gloria runs the design review board like a personal fiefdom, blocking approvals out of spite and inventing rules on the fly. The first sign of trouble came 2 weeks ago when she left a notice on my door about a portable space heater in my garage while I work, calling it a fire code issue even though the fire marshal laughed when I called to ask. Now she is here in person, measuring snow like she is running an investigation, and she has a bag of ice melt she keeps snatching back as a prop every time I try to grab it. The snow started falling 4 days ago, a lake-effect blizzard that dumped 16 inches overnight and kept the plows running non-stop. I shoveled my walk twice the first day, salted it, and went to work for a 12-hour shift because we had inventory deadlines and my boss made it clear attendance was mandatory. When I got home at 2 in the morning, another 6 inches had fallen, and I was too exhausted to shovel again, so I cleared a narrow path to my door and left the rest for morning. That was my mistake. Gloria showed up at 7 with her tape measure, a clipboard, and 2 neighbors whispering with salt buckets in hand. Watching from across the street like this was a spectator sport. She did not knock. She just started measuring the snow depth in 3 spots, writing numbers on her clipboard, and taking photos with her phone. I opened the door in my work boots and parka, still half asleep, and she immediately launched into a speech about emergency snow rules and liability, and how the HOA has zero tolerance for negligence. I asked to see the rule she was citing, and she refused. Rule quote theater is her method, reading a rule out loud but refusing to show the actual text so she can twist it however she wants. She told me the snow policy requires all walkways to be cleared within 6 hours of snowfall ending, which would have been impossible because the snow never stopped for 3 straight days. I pointed that out, and she said, "If you make me repeat myself, it gets more expensive." Then she handed me a certified letter demanding $500 in fines and pretending the snow policy is law, with a deadline of 48 hours to pay or face additional penalties. The letter had no rule citation, no appeals process, just a payment link and a threat. "I have done this before, and people fold every time," Gloria said, smiling as she tucked her clipboard under her arm. That line stuck with me because it was not just a threat, it was a confession. She was telling me this was a pattern, a hustle, and she expected me to fold like everyone else. I did not fold. I took a photo of the letter, checked my lease to confirm the HOA rules were supposed to be available online, and found nothing about a 6-hour snow policy anywhere in the documents. The next day, I filed a formal dispute with the HOA management company, requesting a copy of the snow policy and a breakdown of how the fine was calculated. The response came back in 2 hours, a form email saying disputes must be submitted in person at the clubhouse by 5 p.m. the following day, and the office would be closing early because of the storm. That was my time pressure, a real deadline that forced fast decisions while I was already scrambling to cover shifts at work. I called my supervisor and begged for a half day explaining the HOA situation, and he was not happy, but he let me leave at noon. I drove to the clubhouse through slush and plow spray misting the air, and when I walked in, Gloria was already there with a portable folding sign stand blocking the hallway. The sign had no readable text, but she pointed at it and said it was a notice that the meeting room was reserved for board business. I ignored her and walked past, and she followed me, snapping that I was trespassing. The office clerk, a tired woman in her 50s, looked up from her desk and sighed. Gloria is not on the schedule today, the clerk said quietly. Gloria cut her off. I am here as vice chair of the design review board, and this meeting is now official. She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and suddenly 3 other board members appeared in the doorway, all bundled in winter coats, looking like they had been waiting in the parking lot for a signal. It was a meeting ambush where Gloria tried to railroad a vote while cutting my mic, except there was no mic, just her yelling over me every time I tried to speak. I let her think I was cornered, because my trump card needed her to overreach. I had spent the previous night driving through the neighborhood with my phone camera, documenting every sidewalk that was worse than mine, every driveway with snow piled over the curb, every walkway that had not been touched in days. I had a package of photos proving multiple homeowners violate the same rule without enforcement, but I did not show it yet. I needed Gloria to commit to her story first, to lock herself into the lie that the rule was applied evenly, and I was the only violator. She did exactly that. Standing in the middle of the office, she announced that I was the only homeowner in Northwind Meadows who had failed to clear snow within the required time frame, and the fine was justified because I was creating a liability risk for the entire community. One of the board members, a man in a gray puffer coat, nodded along and said the insurance carrier had been asking questions about slip hazards. I asked if the HOA had records of other violations, and Gloria said no, because there were no other violations. That was the moment I knew I had her. I pulled out my phone, opened my photo folder, and said, "Then how do you explain these?" I started scrolling through the images, one by one, showing sidewalks buried under 8 inches of snow, driveways completely blocked, walkways with ice patches thicker than anything on my property. Gloria's face went red. She lunged for my phone, trying to grab it out of my hand, and I stepped back, holding it out of reach. The office clerk stood up and said, "Ma'am, you cannot do that." Gloria spun around and snapped, "This is HOA business. Stay out of it." The board member in the gray coat cleared his throat and asked to see the photos, and I handed him my phone. He scrolled for maybe 30 seconds, then looked at Gloria and said, "This is a problem." Gloria tried to spin it, saying those properties had been cited too, but the clerk interrupted and said there were no other snow violation files in the system. Gloria said the files were being processed, and the clerk said that was not how it worked. The room got quiet. I said, "I want a formal hearing with the full board, and I want a written copy of the snow policy with the rule citation." Gloria said, "You are not entitled to that." I said, "Then I am not paying the fine, and I will be filing a complaint with the State Attorney General's office for selective enforcement and harassment." That got her attention. She stepped closer, so close I could smell the coffee on her breath, and said, "If you make me repeat myself, it gets more expensive." I did not blink. I said, "I am not paying, and I am not backing down, so do whatever you think you need to do." She smiled, a cold, nasty smile, and said, "Fine. We will see you at the hearing, and when you lose, the fine doubles." She turned and walked out, and the 3 board members followed her like a little parade. The clerk waited until the door closed, then leaned over the desk and whispered, "She has been doing this for 2 years, and nobody fights back because they are scared of the board." I asked if she knew anyone who had been through this before, and she nodded. "There is a woman who used to work for the old management company. She left last year, but she knows how Gloria operates. I will give you her number." She scribbled a name and phone number on a sticky note, Diane Schultz, and handed it over. I called Diane that night, and she picked up on the second ring. When I explained what was happening, she laughed. Not a mean laugh, but a tired, knowing laugh. "Gloria did the same thing to 3 families before I quit," Diane said. "She targets people who work long hours, people who cannot make meetings, people who are too busy to fight. She files bogus violations, jacks up the fines, and counts on you folding because the process is exhausting." I asked if anyone had ever beaten her, and Diane said, "One guy did. He brought a lawyer to the hearing and threatened to sue for harassment, and the board caved immediately. But most people just pay." I asked what evidence I would need, and Diane said, "Document everything, Get witness statements if you can, and make sure you have proof that other violations were ignored. If you can show selective enforcement, the board's insurance carrier will panic because it opens them up to discrimination claims. I thanked her and hung up, and I spent the next 2 days gathering more evidence. I printed comparison photo sets showing multiple sidewalks worse than mine with 0 fines. I wrote a timeline of every interaction with Gloria, and I filed a records request with the county to get copies of any HOA complaints filed with code enforcement. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 6 p.m., which meant I had to leave work early again, and my boss was starting to lose patience. He pulled me aside and said, "I do not know what is going on with your HOA, but if you keep missing shifts, we are going to have a problem." I told him I was handling it, but the truth was the HOA chaos was threatening my job, and that was exactly what Gloria wanted. The day before the hearing, Gloria escalated again. I came home from work to find a surprise inspection crew at my porch, 3 people in reflective vests with clipboards and attitude, claiming they were from the HOA compliance department. I asked for identification, and they showed me laminated badges with the Northwind Meadows logo but no names. I asked what they were inspecting, and the lead guy, a short man with a buzz cut, said they were checking for fire hazards, structural violations, and snow removal compliance. I said, "You cannot enter my property without notice," and he said, "We sent notice. Check your email." I pulled out my phone and checked, and there was nothing. I said, "Show me the email," and he said, "We are not required to provide proof. The notice was sent." It was classic Gloria, using rule quote theater to justify an illegal search. I told them to leave, and the buzzcut guy said, "If you refuse to cooperate, we will file an obstruction report and add it to your violation file." I said, "File whatever you want. You are not coming inside without a warrant," and I shut the door. They stood on my porch for another 10 minutes, taking photos of my garage, my windows, my snow-covered walkway, and then they left. That night I got an email from the HOA saying my hearing had been moved up to the next morning at 9 a.m., with no explanation and no option to reschedule. It was another ambush, designed to catch me at work so I would miss the hearing and lose by default. I called Diane, and she said, "Do not miss it. If you do not show up, they will rule against you and the fine will triple." I called my boss and begged for another half day, and he said, "This is the last time. If you miss another shift, you are done." I showed up at the clubhouse at 8:45, and the parking lot was empty except for Gloria's car and a black SUV I did not recognize. Inside, Gloria was sitting at a folding table with 2 other board members, the guy in the gray coat and a woman in her 60s with silver hair. There was no clerk, no recorder, no audience, just the 4 of us. Gloria smiled and said, "Thank you for coming. Let us get started." I said, "Where is the rest of the board?" She said, "This is a design review subcommittee hearing. We have quorum." I said, "I requested a full board hearing." She said, "Your request was denied. This is the process." I sat down and pulled out my evidence packet, a clean folder with printed photos, a timeline, and a copy of the HOA bylaws I had finally tracked down online. Gloria slid a paper across the table and said, "This is the snow policy, as you can see. It clearly states all walkways must be cleared within 6 hours." I read the page, and it was a printed excerpt from a document with no header, no date, no rule number. I said, "This is not an official rule. Where is the full policy document?" She said, "This is all you need." I said, "I need the original document with the adoption date and the board vote record." She said, "That is not how this works." The woman with silver hair leaned forward and said, "Let us move on. Do you dispute the violation?" I said, "Yes, I dispute it, and I have evidence that the rule is not being applied evenly." I opened my folder and started laying out the photos, one by one, showing sidewalks across the neighborhood that had not been touched in a week. Gloria did not even look at them. She said, "Those properties are not under review today." I said, "That is selective enforcement, and it is illegal." She said, "We enforce rules as we see fit, and you are out of compliance." The gray coat guy looked uncomfortable, and he said, "Gloria, maybe we should review these photos." Gloria snapped, "We do not have time for this. The decision is final." I said, "The decision cannot be final. We are in the hearing right now." She said, "The subcommittee has already voted. We are just here to inform you of the result." I stood up. I said, "That is not a hearing, that is a railroad, and I am filing a formal complaint with the management company and the state." Gloria stood up too, and she said, "If you file a complaint, I will personally make sure every inch of your property is inspected, and I will find violations you did not even know existed." If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, hit like and subscribe for more stories like this one. That was the moment I realized Gloria was not just petty, she was vindictive, and she was willing to break the rules to win. I pulled out my phone and said, "I am recording this conversation, and I am going to submit it as evidence of retaliation and harassment." Gloria's face went white. She said, "You cannot record without consent." I said, "Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state. I can record any conversation I am part of, and you just threatened me on the record." The silver-haired woman stood up and said, "This hearing is over." I said, "Fine, I will see you in court," and I walked out. I drove straight to the county sheriff's substation, which was only 10 minutes away, and I asked to file a report for harassment and intimidation. The deputy on duty, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense expression, listened to my story and reviewed the recording I had made. She said, "This sounds like a civil issue, but if she is making threats, you can file for a protection order." I asked if there was anything else I could do, and she said, "Document everything, keep copies of all your evidence, and if she shows up at your property again, call us." I handed her a clean packet of my evidence, a wet boot print photo packet I had been keeping closed, and I asked for an incident number. She wrote one down on a slip of paper and said, "Keep this. If you need to reference this report later, use this number." That afternoon, I got a call from Diane. She said, "I heard about your hearing. Gloria is telling people you tried to assault her." I said, "That is a lie. I recorded the whole thing." She said, "I know, but she is already spreading the story, and the board is voting tonight on whether to file a trespassing complaint against you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For showing up at the clubhouse without an appointment." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd I did not know how else to react. I said, "I had a hearing, they moved it up, I showed up on time." Diane said, "It does not matter. Gloria is rewriting the narrative, and unless you fight back now, she is going to bury you." I asked what I should do, and she said, "Go to the board meeting tonight, bring your evidence, and make them listen." The meeting was at 7 p.m., and I got there at 6:30 to make sure I had a seat. The clubhouse meeting room was small, maybe 20 chairs, and half of them were already filled with neighbors I did not recognize. Gloria was at the front table with the full board, 5 people total, and she had her portable folding sign stand set up next to her chair with a stack of papers on top. When I walked in, she looked up and smiled. She said, "I am glad you are here. We have a lot to discuss." The meeting started with routine business, budget updates, landscaping bids, nothing interesting. Then Gloria stood up and said, "We have a special agenda item. A motion to issue a formal trespassing warning to a homeowner who has been repeatedly violating board protocols." She did not say my name, but everyone in the room turned to look at me. I stood up and said, "I am here to respond to that motion, and I have evidence that the vice chair has been selectively enforcing rules and retaliating against me for filing a dispute." Gloria said, "You are out of order. Sit down." I said, "This is a public meeting. I have a right to speak." The board president, a man in his 70s with white hair, sighed and said, "Let him speak. We will hear both sides." I walked to the front and laid out my evidence on the table. The photos, the timeline, the recording. I said, "Gloria has been targeting me with bogus fines, refusing to provide rule documentation, and threatening me with inspections if I file complaints. I have proof that other homeowners have worse violations and have not been cited, and I have a recording of her admitting that she does this regularly. The room went quiet. Gloria stood up and said, "Those photos are out of context. Those properties were cited." I said, "Then show me the citations." She said, "They are being processed." I said, "The office clerk told me there are no other snow violation files in the system." Gloria's face went red, and she said, "The clerk does not have access to all files." The board president said, "Gloria, do we have other snow violation files?" She hesitated, then said, "We have verbal warnings." I said, "Verbal warnings are not enforceable. The bylaws require written notice." The president looked at the other board members, and the woman with silver hair said, "I think we need to table this motion until we can review the evidence." Gloria slammed her hand on the table and said, "We do not have time to table this. The insurance carrier is asking questions, and we need to show we are enforcing the rules." I said, "Then enforce them evenly. Cite every property in those photos, or drop the fine against me." Gloria said, "That is not your decision to make." I said, "It is not yours either, it is the board's decision, so let them vote." The president said, "All in favor of tabling the trespassing motion and reviewing the evidence, raise your hand." 3 hands went up, including the president. Gloria did not raise her hand, and neither did the guy in the gray coat. The motion was tabled. Gloria grabbed her papers and stormed out, and the meeting continued without her. After the meeting, the president pulled me aside and said, "I am sorry this has been so difficult. Gloria has been on the board for 5 years, and she has always been aggressive, but this is the first time anyone has pushed back with documentation." I said, "I just want the fine dropped and the harassment to stop." He said, "I will talk to the management company and see what we can do." I thanked him and left, but I knew this was not over. Gloria was not the type to back down quietly. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a tow sticker on my windshield, a bright orange notice with bold letters saying my vehicle was in violation of parking rules and would be towed in 24 hours. I checked my parking spot, and I was inside the lines, fully legal, no obstructions. I called the towing company listed on the sticker, and the dispatcher said the order came from the HOA compliance department. I asked what the violation was, and she said, "Unauthorized overnight parking." I said, "I live here. I am authorized to park here." She said, "You will have to take it up with the HOA." I took a photo of the sticker in my parking spot, and I emailed it to the board president with a subject line, "Retaliation continues." He replied an hour later, "I did not authorize this. I will look into it." The next morning, the sticker was gone, but Gloria was waiting in the parking lot when I left for work. She was standing next to her car with a clipboard, and when she saw me, she walked over. She said, "You think you are smart, do not you?" I said, "I think I am following the rules." She said, "The rules are whatever the board says they are, and I am on the board." I said, "You are 1 vote out of 5, and 3 of them just voted against you." She stepped closer, so close I could see the ice crystals on her pink beanie, and she said, "I have done this before, and people fold every time. But you are different. You actually think you can win." I said, "I do not need to win. I just need you to stop." She smiled, and it was the coldest smile I had ever seen. She said, "I am not going to stop. I am going to make your life so miserable you will move out, and then I will do it to the next person, because that is what I do." I pulled out my phone and said, "Say that again." She looked at the phone, and her smile disappeared. She turned and walked back to her car without another word. That recording became part of my trump card, but I still was not ready to play it. I needed one more piece, something that would force the board to act. Diane called me that night and said, "I talked to someone at the insurance carrier. They have been asking the HOA for documentation of enforcement policies, and Gloria has been stalling." I said, "Why does the insurance company care?" She said, Because selective enforcement is a liability, if someone sues for discrimination, the carrier is on the hook, and they do not like that. I said, so if I can prove selective enforcement, the carrier will pressure the board? She said absolutely. They will demand policy changes, and if the board does not comply, the carrier can drop them. I asked how to contact the carrier, and Diane said, "You do not. I will do it. I still have contacts there." 2 days later, the board president called me and said, "We need to meet in person, not at the clubhouse." He suggested a mediation table in the sheriff's substation lobby, neutral ground with a deputy watching the escalation. I agreed, and we met the next afternoon. The president was there, along with the woman with silver hair and one other board member I had not met before. Gloria was not invited. The president said, "The insurance carrier sent us a letter. They are concerned about selective enforcement and retaliation claims, and they want us to resolve this immediately." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means we are dropping the fine, and we are issuing a formal warning to Gloria to stop targeting homeowners without board approval." I said that is not enough. I want a written apology and a guarantee that this will not happen again. The woman with silver hair said, "We can do the apology, but we cannot control Gloria's behavior outside of board meetings." I said, "Then remove her from the board." The president said, "We cannot do that without a vote, and we do not have the votes." I said, "Then I will file a lawsuit for harassment and discrimination, and I will include the insurance carrier's letter as evidence that the board knew about the problem and did not fix it." The president looked at the other board members, and they looked at each other. The woman with silver hair said, "What if we put Gloria on administrative leave from the design review board, effective immediately, and we appoint an independent reviewer to audit all her decisions from the past year?" I said, "That works, but I want it in writing, and I want the audit results made public." The president nodded and said, "Done." We shook hands, and I left. The next day, I got a formal letter from the board, signed by the president, stating that the $500 fine had been rescinded, Gloria had been placed on administrative leave, and an independent audit of design review board decisions would be completed within 60 days. The letter also included a written apology for the inconvenience and stress caused by the dispute. I thought that was the end of it, but Gloria had one more move. A week later, I got a call from Diane, and she was laughing. She said, "You are not going to believe this. The insurance carrier just issued a non-renewal warning to the HOA. They are demanding reforms within 90 days, or they are dropping coverage." I said, "What kind of reforms?" She said, "New enforcement policies, mandatory training for board members, and removal of any board member with a history of retaliation complaints." I said, "That is Gloria." She said, "That is Gloria." The board called an emergency meeting, and the entire neighborhood showed up because word had spread that the HOA might lose insurance. Gloria tried to speak, but the president cut her off and said, "The board has voted to accept your resignation, effective immediately." Gloria said, "You cannot do that." The president said, "We just did." The vote was unanimous. Gloria stood up, grabbed her bag of ice melt, and walked out, slamming the door so hard the portable folding sign stand fell over. The room erupted in applause, and I just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. The president looked at me and said, "Thank you for not backing down. You saved this neighborhood from a lawsuit we could not afford." I nodded, but I did not feel like a hero. I just felt tired. The audit came back 6 weeks later, and it was brutal. Gloria had issued over 50 violations in the past year, and 42 of them were either bogus or selectively enforced. The board refunded fines to 12 homeowners, and the HOA attorney forced a reversal to reduce liability on another 8 cases. The insurance carrier accepted the reforms, and the coverage was renewed, but the premiums went up 15% because of the claims risk. The neighborhood was not happy about that, but they were even less happy with Gloria. She moved out 3 months later, and the for sale sign on her lawn stayed up for 6 months before anyone bought the place. I ran into Diane at the grocery store a few weeks after Gloria left, and she said, "You know what the funniest part is?" I said, What? She said, Gloria's own messages contradict her story, and the room saw it live. During the emergency meeting, the president had played a recording of a board call where Gloria admitted she targeted people who worked long hours because they were less likely to fight back. Her exact words were, "I have done this before, and people fold every time." The room had gone silent when they heard it, and Gloria's smug smile vanished when the room turned on her. Diane said, that recording was her own boomerang. She thought she was untouchable, and it came back and hit her in the face. I said, I just wanted her to stop. Diane said, you did more than that. You changed how this HOA operates, and you gave other people the courage to fight back. I did not feel like I had changed anything, but over the next few months I noticed things were different. The board started posting rules online with clear citations and adoption dates. They created an appeals process with written guidelines. They hired a professional management company to handle enforcement, and they trained board members on fair housing laws and liability. It was not perfect, but it was better. I still live in Northwind Meadows, and I still work the forklift lead job at the warehouse. The neighborhood is quieter now, and the HOA does not feel like an enforcement opportunity anymore. Every time it snows, I shovel my walk within a few hours, not because I am scared of a fine, but because I do not want to give anyone a reason to start the cycle again. I keep the evidence packet in my desk drawer just in case, but I have not needed it. Gloria is gone, the board is reformed, and the insurance carrier is watching. Sometimes I see the portable folding sign stand in the clubhouse storage closet, and I remember the blizzard argument where she slapped a toe sticker on my windshield and called it procedure as my breath fogged the camera. I remember her yelling about snow depth while holding a tape measure like a weapon, and I remember the moment her smug smile vanished when the room turned on her. I do not miss any of it, but I am glad I fought back, because if I had not, she would still be doing it to someone else. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.